We hold events about once a month. I am Zara Tinholt, and I am going to be the moderator for tonight. I am the Corporate Operations Director for tonight will basically be
check.
Does that one work?
Yeah.
Perfect. Yay. All right. So we are going to start with a presentation by Matthew, and then from there we are going to take a very short stretch break, and we are going to move on to the panel. And with us tonight for the panel, we have Manny Bahia from the Daily Hive. We have Matthew, and then we also have Brittany Whitmore from Exvera Communications. Oh, Andrew. Sorry, Andrew. All right. So welcome, and I'm just going to pass it off to Matthew, and enjoy.
Hi, thank you. Cool. Well, thanks everyone for coming out. We've got some really good stuff, as Zara was mentioning. Before we get into the concepts of marketing, one of the other sides, especially in the blockchain world, that's becoming a more and more a bigger and bigger thing is privacy, your data, and I'm sure everyone can kind of close that loop to see where that ties in with marketing. So about almost 4 years ago, this article came out where there was concerns over the amount of personal data that people could access through your Facebook profile, as an example. So we get into the conversations of the world of big data, and I don't know, show of hands in the room, who here has heard of this story? Cool. It's pretty hard to miss it right now, and yet this information as of the 2016 US election was all known. And yet all of a sudden now it's making the news, and now people are really getting concerned with it, where they have profiles of about 250 million direct users on Facebook, where Cambridge Analytica created all sorts of surveys, or the companies that they were working with created surveys. So, you know, like which, I don't know, Star Wars character are you, or any of these different things were used to gather people's data, but also who your friends are, what your friends' interests are, who do you like, etc. Out of those 240,000 people, they were able to create profiles of about 50 million people with all sorts of direct information. And then with that, actually use some of Facebook's marketing tactics to basically target people during the US election and be able to put literally what they call one-to-one marketing. So if they know based on your likes and your dislikes that you feel a certain way about a hot political topic, they can hit you with a certain ad that, you know, might come from a completely unreliable blog, but it'll stick with you that this politician here hates this thing. And Cambridge Analytica was hired by Donald Trump, and we know how that went in their election. It took a lot of people by surprise. Cambridge Analytica was also behind Brexit, which is very interesting, and they work very closely with a Canadian political CRM company based here in Vancouver, actually. So this data is available on, I would say, a lot of people in this room. So Jane in the back, we know it's your 7th time going for a credit score. You're probably not likely to get a house for, you know, a credit score of 463. This information is actually all associated with you, with your Facebook profile and all sorts of other stuff. There's a lot of very interesting things, and actually really scary things when you start thinking about your data and where is it going. There's also been a lot of talk about our data being the new oil, and I think this is really a world that we're going, and especially in the blockchain world, you'll see some examples, and I think I brought this up before, where maybe you don't always need a genius Solidity Ethereum programmer who's got a really good idea for blockchain, doesn't necessarily need a hard drive full of passports. or all of that passport information. You know, as an example, we talked to one person today who was saying, well, you know, the last ICO that I did, we were doing 40,000 IDs per second. You know, how's your system work with this and that? And I was just thinking about like how many people's information this person has been before, you know, our ID product was there, how much personal information is passing through hard drives and CSV files and email transmissions and all sorts of other non-secured ways of storing that data and transmitting that data. So, little story, I recently stopped by this company. I actually quite like their products, and bought a pair of jeans, or bought a pair of pants, pardon me, and paid with Stripe. So Stripe has my email. I just swipe my credit card. My credit card is attached to my email. A receipt shows up. I don't have to put anything other than sign for it. And so the funny thing is I recently, just in the last 2 weeks, bought something at the store in Boston from this company. And you know, keep that in mind as we go through the presentation, because as I was building these slides and finding examples of issues around data privacy, there emerged a very interesting story about how much data they had and how they could find me pretty much anywhere on the internet. So one of the next things that we see around who do we trust with our data, and this is a perfect example just from last year, and the amount of data that we have that we're providing to a company like Equifax that we actually often don't give our information, but they have all this information on us. And then of course there was several million users in the US, and then in Canada about 19,000 is what the estimate is of personal information being lost over a breach in this one database that held everything. And so this is where you start getting into some of the risks of centralized databases versus decentralization, where you see it's called honeypots. And if you can get into this one database, you have millions of users of information and very valuable information. Whereas if the data is stored in separate or in silos, or it's only your information being stored somewhere, it's much less valuable to a hacker. It's a lot of work to access the information of one person, and most likely they'll go after Richard Branson over me. So another example, and you know, the bottom right there is a perfect example. When I was looking up this thing to say, okay, well, let's look at the SEC hack, because we just talked about Equifax, major financial data company. The SEC is a government application. Their EDGAR system was hacked. It's now suspected by Eastern European hackers. They acquired personal information, social security numbers, information. What the system that was hacked with EDGAR was actually what they called a staging environment. So if you want to register an exempt filing or a public registration, you can go into EDGAR and start filling in the forms, but you don't have to publish it so that the world can see, or even that you're passing it off to the SEC. So this staging environment was the environment that was hacked. So you can imagine the number of public and private companies that were considering doing some sort of securities offerings or some sort of activity. And that information was there, and now all of this information that they maybe decided never to go ahead with, but all this private information is now in the hands of some hackers. Then you see scenarios where recently we saw this product that hit the market, and from what we've been able to tell in their news feeds, they have a very interesting product where they said, okay, well, we've got these honeypots of data, all this data everywhere, so let's separate all the data, and all of your information can be on your own unique blockchain key, essentially, your secure key. But then we run into massive problems with the whole idea of, well, that's okay for cryptography today, but what happens if, one, I have a right to be forgotten, and two, what happens in 20 years from now when the blockchain still holds your personal information, still holds your social security or social insurance number, and now all of a sudden that cryptography legacy is outdated, and how do you manage that? And so I think as we think about immutable technology like blockchain and initial coin offerings, we have to actually really think carefully about what information are we putting onto things like a decentralized public ledger. And then of course we see our little friends over here offering pants and jackets and coats again. And again, didn't visit their website, but because they had my email and that was attached to my browsing history, this is following me around the internet through something called retargeting, which I'm sure some of our panelists will be able to talk more about how to do that. Because while we see this and sometimes it's like, oh man, these guys got my identity, you know what? It works because I bought a bunch of stuff from these guys. So, you know, there is that too. In the ICO world, cybersecurity is probably just as bad, if not worse. This is a stat from Ernst & Young in January, and you see that the major amount of cybersecurity risks that we're seeing, and it's not as much on-chain problems, on the blockchain problems, but it's actually a lot of problems with how the data is managed and processed. Having an ID product, which I'll show in a second, the amount of times that I've heard people say to me, hey, I've got a whole list of people that want to get into our ICO. It's already ready to go. Can I just send the CSV to you? And I'm like, don't you dare. We don't want that in our inbox. And that's a lot of personal information. And it's very important in our business model to try to eliminate as much of that risk in our business model about holding all sorts of personal information so that we aren't a target for hacking. And by structuring things in a way that is still giving people ownership of their information and actual insight into what sort of information are people accessing on you on a regular basis. So here's an example of one scenario of what not to do. This was an ICO with, I believe, a mostly Canadian and some people in Vancouver on this team. And what they used was DocuSign. So they said, go ahead, put all this information into DocuSign, upload your passport photo here and everything, and then this all ends up on their hard drives, on their systems, or in their DocuSign folders. And if they're taking money from people in many parts of the world, like Thailand, Singapore, Philippines, I believe Japan, but I'm not 100% sure on that. In those parts of the world, they're actually criminally liable for this, and they've actually broken criminal code. In places like Europe, as of May, it's a minimum $20 million fine to do it this way. So when you're thinking about how to do identity, maybe doing it in a way where you can not take ownership of all this information, and that's actually a big part of what we focused on in our ID product. If anyone is looking at launching an ICO, we run into a scenario where we use something called zero knowledge proof. And so this is an example on an ICO issuer, the information that they see on the dashboard. So rather than seeing all of this information, they actually get to see things like your public address. They see how much money is it based on the transaction. And then they click through on that, and then they can see things like what are things like fraud and risk and all sorts of, if you have been listed on that, but they actually don't need your name and your address and your social insurance number in order to be fed the information to make a decision about the transaction. It's something called zero knowledge proof. You can prove all the risk around it without necessarily releasing somebody's identity every single time. So, and then of course, what about the right to your own information? I know this has been something that's really annoying. Like you say, oh, I want an Equifax report. Or what about what's on my medical file? Well, you can't look at that. That's for your doctors. And so when we were looking at this, we said, well, it's actually important that as an individual, you can see some of your own information, both risks and scoring and AML concerns. AML is anti-money laundering, or anti-terrorist financing is ATF. Some of these concerns that you might be being flagged for that you're not aware of. Or maybe there's certain things like some of your tax information. So we're rolling out an integration that allows us to generate tax forms and information around taxes. And then, of course, if you lose your wallet, that's a major problem. Or if it's lost or stolen, that can be, well, it's the same as losing it, I guess, but you get the point. But then as well, one of the pieces that we are building in is if somebody's accessing your information, it might actually be worthwhile for you to have a record of that yourself, because whose data is it, right? And so I want to play a little game here before we bring up our panel, and this is just a little bit of do's and don'ts. And so I'll go through a couple different things, and this is more specific to the marketing on the ICO side of things. We were actually hoping to bring somebody from a securities law and that side of background to actually go through some of these things, but because we can't speak to that specific legal opinion, we thought it might be good to kind of do a little bit of this. So just with a show of hands, if you were marketing an ICO, who here thinks this would be lawful or acceptable or would not get you into hot water with the securities regulator. Is there anybody that thinks we're good here? We're all in agreement. Yeah, guaranteeing returns, probably not a good way to start. The next big ICO. I'm curious out of the people in the room here. Somebody's got to raise. There, we got some hands raised. There we go. Cool. So the interesting thing about the next big ICO is then you get into the next big around what? And the big concern with phrases like this is, are you marketing the fact that you're doing an ICO, that someone can buy something and then flip it and sell it? Starting to sound a lot like a security. Sounds like there's a lot of securities regulations about this. And really what it's creating is a bit of that FOMO environment. This is going to be the big one. You got to get into this. If you're selling your token as a utility, then let's talk about what's your token. Like, what does your token do? What's the function of it? What's the utility of this? How does that benefit me in my life? Because if this token, if I want to buy this token to solve some problem in my life, what is the utility of that token? It should probably be a better focus of your marketing rather than this is the next big thing. If you miss out on this, you might get into trouble. This one kind of goes, this is actually verbatim from an ad that we pulled. There's a number of here that are actually directly off of ICOs in the last couple of months. Actually, all of them are. So again, very much to the last one, next big thing, you missed Bitcoin. It's all about FOMO, right? And if you're getting into that whole FOMO, fear of missing out, if you're getting into that whole scenario, you're really starting to promote things in a way that make it feel and seem like this is an investment or a gamble or a speculation, and this, you know, pump this up and sell it before it goes down. These are some of the scenarios. This one was funny. Who saw this one? This one, the SEC came out and shut it all down, so we know how that went. And this one just recently was mentioned last week, I believe it was, by a prominent TV celebrity, which I thought was hilarious because the SEC does not approve ICOs. The SEC might allow you to list your ICO, but they don't put their stamp of approval on it and say, hey, this is an SEC-approved investment. That doesn't happen with any investment, whether it comes from a major bank or from a startup. The SEC doesn't approve stuff, but they will come and talk to you if you go offside. So there's this whole concept of, oh, this is an SEC-approved asset-backed token that's, you know, is that where the world is going, where we're going to have to disclose our ICO? If we're going to launch one, disclose it to our local regulators, disclose it to the regulators of the jurisdictions that we want to sell to investors in. I believe that's where the world is going. But does that mean that the regulators are putting their stamp of approval and their endorsement on your offering? That's a very different statement. So that's just a little bit of fun around that to give you guys a little bit of a sense. But now that we've talked about data from your side as the data subject, if you will, I want to turn it over to our panel and actually get into more of how we can use this data, things like whether it's digital marketing or whether it's PR, you know, or community management is another key piece of that. How these different tactics and strategies can be used to engage your audience, to get people excited about what your vision is with your project. Because a lot of the people that are here to do ICOs, it's not just about Lambos. Most of the people that I know are actually really trying to do something that's going to change the world. And how do you get people inspired to be a part of that vision as a bigger picture? So I'm going to pass it over to Zara, and we'll get started.
All right, so first we've got Andrew Wagner from ESL Coin. And hang on, we're going to bring over the other two. All right, so we've got Brittany Whitmore from Exvera Communications and Manny Bahia from the Daily Hive. All right, so we're going to start with a few questions, and it'll just basically how it's going to work is we have a couple questions we're going to ask to kick things off, and then I'm going to open it up for a couple questions from the audience if you guys have anything you want to follow up with, and we'll kind of keep going back and forth with that kind of format. So this is an open call for whoever wants to answer. How important is privacy in my ICO marketing?
I think it depends on your ICO and its niche it's targeting. You know, I am involved in different projects, and some are, we have different approaches based upon the partners required for those types of projects. You know, when we're doing ESL Coin, we try to keep it way more above board than when we're building like a virtual blockchain-based video game, for example. I think you should be versatile.
It's interesting. You see some of these projects integrating blockchain and other similar technologies for the purpose of privacy as well. So protect your identity, own all of your personal information. So I think when you're taking that kind of route, it really is important to make sure that you have that integrity throughout the ICO process as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, now that you're seeing it in the media, you know, a lot of concern around privacy. It's at the forefront, of course, right? You know, with everything going on with like Facebook and everything. So, absolutely.
Okay, great. Okay, so next question. I have a list of names and emails. Can I market to them?
A list of email names. Sorry.
Oh man.
A list of names and emails.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, obviously, there's the castle laws, and you know, having an email list worked a couple of years ago, but now with the new laws, obviously, you know, you got to have users opt in to, you know, receive any sort of information, and for you to absolutely sell something to them.
You can like send personal emails though, is my understanding. I'm not a lawyer though, so don't quote me.
I think you have to go one by one then, I think, right?
Yeah, you'd have to go kind of like one by one and send, or, you know, make it seem like you're going one by one. No, send personal emails I think is fine. I mean, I cold outreach to people all the time. Usually it is more personalized. So like, hey, I noticed you've been writing about X, Y, Z. Thought I would tell you about this and that. I'd love to get your opinion on it. So I'm constantly reaching out to people, but not spamming them, because that's not gonna be good.
Yeah, more so if, I have no idea if there's legal or regulatory issues about this issue, but in terms of effectiveness, like, people are less interested if it's very clear that this was a cold introduction, and I've pretty much set most of those to spam in my email, because I work at NewsBTC, I have to, due to the volume of them. What works better, especially if you're gonna do that, do not do it like BCC, where I can tell that you did that. At least pretend you didn't do that, to make it look like, hey, Andrew, you know. But other than that, yeah, people prefer genuinity. That's the real downside here.
And get their names right. If you're like copy pasting to 5 different people, change the name and like get rid of the formatting, because you can tell.
That's great. Okay, so what are the key areas to consider when marketing an ICO?
So there's a few things. You need to think about the community that you're building. You need to think about the assets that you're going to need, and you need to think about your PR communication strategy. Assets, pretty obvious. You got to have the white paper. You got to have the website. You got to have all of that put together. Community, that's a huge piece of this. I'm sure Andrew has a lot to say about that. But how are you going to communicate to them? How are you going to build that community? How are you going to reach out to not only that crypto savvy audience, but also that more mainstream audience? Because you really do need to talk to both. So having a strategy for each of those, and having a really strong story, really understanding what is the problem that this product is going to solve, who is my audience, how am I helping them, and really focusing your messaging on that is the key.
Yeah, and I think it really starts with the creative assets for sure, as Brittany was saying. You see a lot of, you know, chains that are like locked together, or like a lot of background with like a galaxy or something. It's pretty much similar across the board. It's how you can distinguish yourself, you know, make it more slick, how you can make it more welcoming, and it starts from there. And then that way, then you can distribute that to different channels, whether it be through, you know, some social media, or web, and various community groups and things and channels there.
I love that you briefly mentioned the design, because I think EOS did a really great job with their logo. If nothing else, I think they did a really great job with it. It's very memorable.
I generally agree with what they said, especially the parts where they're framing it like you're creating a story. There are so many ICOs out there, and people are really looking for something interesting. you know? And a lot of these people have lots of coins lying around. They can invest here or there based on their philosophical beliefs. So if you make it sound boring, that's almost worse than making it sound like a bad investment sometimes to some of these demographics. Just make a narrative.
Absolutely. In fact, you know who did this really well was Filecoin. They actually, when they did their ICO, they invited Bloomberg to come in and witness an ICO as it happens. Absolutely brilliant. It's this amazing asset now that lives on Bloomberg. Invited them in, oh, here's how it happens, running every 24 hours, you know, oh, look, here's a scammer, here's how we dealt with it, and took them through that entire process. Having assets like that is absolutely incredible. Civic did a great video as well. It was very easy to understand, very clear. You could really understand the value. So don't underestimate the power of an amazing video.
Yeah, people love behind the scenes stuff too, so that's really cool. It's a good example.
Yeah. So what are examples of things you cannot say when marketing an ICO?
All the stuff he showed you on the slides earlier, that was no every time.
300% returns guaranteed.
10,000%.
Oh man, how do I invest?
But like beyond that, like beyond things that will get you in legal trouble, like things that will make the community dislike you.
Yeah, there's a very specific process for selling securities, which is I would suggest taking the security route if you can, and there's a very specific process. Definitely talk to a lawyer for that. There's a prospectus and there's all these different pieces, so really follow that, and that'll keep you sleeping at night.
Yeah, I mean, in short, you're not supposed to really market to unaccredited investors and promise egregious returns. Those rules and regulations are there to protect, you know, the average person, the average investor from suffering loss, because they're not as informed and sophisticated as investors. So, you know, promising them, you know, 300% in like 1 week and all that sort of stuff, you know, get rich quick sort of schemes, definitely a no-no.
All right, last question before we take it to the audience for a couple. What steps are there in the process? So from a marketing perspective.
So I would say it's kind of what I was saying. I mean, maybe I would love to hear what you guys are doing, but what I would say is get your legal sorted out, figure out what your coin is, what is it going to do, all that stuff, and then move into the marketing side. So get your white paper together. And I suggest always write your own white paper. You know, you can hire people to write them for you, but I would say you should probably write it yourself, so you'll be able to answer those questions when people have them for you. So get that in order, get your website in order, get all your messaging in order, and then really start focusing on building that community. And there's so many great tools that you can use for that. You know, there's Steemit, there's Telegram, and everything else. So really start building that community and build it around the purpose of what you're trying to achieve. You know, you look at something like RightMesh, which is a great local example, and they're doing connectivity for people, whether, you know, if there's a natural disaster or you just, you know, there's a lot of communities that are actually outside of, you know, LTE and everything else. So it's a really great mission, really inspiring, and get people on board with that. And then what happens next?
Well, at NewsBTC, we don't have to worry about that regulatory stuff, thank God. That's what he's for. We just promote things and try to pick good projects. Really, to be honest, in terms of marketing ICOs, step one is to choose a good one to market in the first place. Especially because if you think about what we described about in terms of crafting a story, why is this ICO interesting? Not every ICO is interesting. I get lots of things in my inbox, and I just pick the one. I get bored easily. I pick the ones that aren't boring. And it turns out a lot of the time that a lot of the random early adopters also don't find those boring. And beyond that, you just gotta reach the community and honestly spread the story. A lot of the tricks people will cite, I feel, don't work. I'm not even very worried about the loss of Google ads, for example. I think most of the ICOs that were utilizing those were marketing in a worse manner, you know, like just targeting newbies. Like if they probably had their ads set to target newbies on purpose. Now, if you want to go long term, you just got to create a cool story about this. Why do you want to support this, and why won't you lose your money supporting this?
Oh yeah, sorry. Yeah, I mean, the importance of community that Brittany and Andrew touched on is so important, and that storytelling aspect in the beginning, because ultimately, I mean, you want your coin to be worth something and appreciate in value, and so having that core group and, you know, keeping that, you know, the float tight and everything, and then when new investors are coming in, you know, you keep your core strong, it's going to lead to a quicker appreciation as well, and then everyone's happy.
Absolutely, and you can also involve your community in this whole process. So set bounties, ask for feedback, offer tokens for feedback on, hey, we've got this prototype of the thing we're building. Not only does that show progress in your ICO, but it also gives your community a chance to have input, shows them you care about them, you really value their opinion. Hey, look, and they can even get some tokens. So now they're even more invested and they're going to share it with their community.
All right, we're going to open it up to the audience for a question or two. Does anyone here have a question for our panelists? All right, we'll start over here.
Maybe not so much a question, but I just wanted to clarify on the email thing, because from my perspective, the way you guys answered it could open people up to fines beyond their wildest belief. We do a ton of autoresponder work through one of my software companies. And the real reality is the correct answer to that question is no, absolutely do not use that email list. Because unless you generated it opt-in for the specific information you're about to send, the fines are literally in the millions of dollars per email that you sent out. So the real answer is no. The creative ways around it can help because it'll slow you down enough that you probably won't get in trouble. But if you have 100,000 emails, consider them dead. Unless they're in America, then do whatever you want, because it's okay.
Yeah, I really appreciate that, actually. It's definitely not a lawyer.
Okay.
Hi there. I have a question. So when it comes to marketing, what is the major difference between traditional IPO versus ICO?
Well, I mean, ICO is so new, right? And then, you know, IPO has had, you know, the framework in place for so long, has, you know, gone through its obstacles, and rules and regulations have been created. So in terms of marketing, you know, an IPO versus an ICO, I think it's better to tread on the safe path and follow kind of the rules and regulations for an IPO. But ultimately, honestly, it comes down to a really strong coin that you strongly believe in fundamentally, great story, creating more informed content, right? That's informative, sorry. And like even things like the entrepreneurs and their journey, or like Brittany was saying, like behind the scenes, things like that really catch people's attention. So I'd say market in that way, where you're actually providing value to the readers or the viewers.
And also, the interesting thing about the ICO marketing space is you have a few different camps. You've got the people who are really savvy, and they've been, you know, working on this stuff for a while. They understand the technology. And you have the camp that really doesn't necessarily understand the technology. So, you know, it takes kind of two different messages for each of these. Some of them really, you don't need to explain, you know, distributed ledger, you don't need to explain any of that. And some of them want to know about all that. I don't understand how this works, explain to me how this works. So I think as far as it counter to a traditional IPO, I don't think that's as much of a problem historically. So I think that's definitely something to think about.
I guess the biggest difference, if you want to look at it from a marketing perspective, would be that marketing and ICO would be more mass marketing oriented than marketing an IPO, to the degree that IPOs, at least in most jurisdictions and how we approach them, have to target accredited investors and certain types of people. For example, when you set up a Facebook ad, you can choose by age, gender, background. There's not an accredited investor one where you can target those. And so that really your marketing with an IPO is way more social. You're at conferences, you're going through back channels. With an ICO, you're more allowed to have advertisements and reach masses because you don't have to be, I mean, you say no Americans and stuff like that, but I mean, if they live in Malta or something, you get the idea. You can mass target them safely.
That's what I say of my parties, no Americans. Just kidding.
Okay, I'm going to do one more question. I think, did you have one? Okay, all right. So we're going to do one more, and then we're going to do a couple more from us, and then we're going to go back to the audience.
So there's a lot of strategies out. Sorry, I'm just gonna. So there's a lot of strategies out there for the peak time to target ICO investors and the peak time to target after ICO's launch. For majority of successful larger projects, when do you see that usually being in terms of days before ICOs going live and ICOs after they've had token distribution?
I never thought about it. I've noticed a lot of variability there. You know, that's more dependent upon the team and how fast they can move in their circumstances, I think.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. I mean, there's often a great benefit to urgency. However, if you have not had time to build a strong community, then it's probably not going to do so well. So that's a really interesting question. I think it probably depends on the strength of your community. If you've already got people behind you and behind your mission, you can probably do it quickly and really take advantage of urgency. But if you really are still building your story, then you're probably going to need a little bit more time. Although some of these ones that run for like, you know, a year or something, it seems like a little bit, maybe that's a little bit much. So, you know, keep it short if you can, but definitely judge by your community strength.
Yeah, just start early enough to start building that story and building that hype and then building that core community. And then you'll kind of have to adapt and be agile and test different timings at times as well.
All right, this actually ties directly into the next question, which is, how is marketing different for digital marketing, PR, and community engagement?
Those are almost the same thing now.
I mean, on the digital marketing side of things, I think Snapchat just banned as well advertising, but you still got Microsoft, Bing, if anyone uses that, and LinkedIn, which is no, I use Microsoft products, so but or LinkedIn, which is owned by Microsoft, and also, I mean, Twitter, everything goes, right? So you'll start seeing the folks that were looking for information about ICOs through the channels that have banned them start gravitating towards some of these other channels that still allow them for this time right now. There's still a lot of potential there on the SEO side of things and building strong, informative content that's valuable. I think one side that's overlooked at times is definitely video. Video has huge potential, has been underutilized, I think, especially through the mainstream. So that's something to look at.
I definitely agree. And, you know, for someone like me who is on the PR side, I'm like, okay, less ad money, more PR money. Sounds great. But I think it kind of does mean that. It gives you the opportunity to try out these other channels and really focus on that's not just quick win, okay, spend $1 million on ads, get this out of it, boom, boom. But really focus on building a more in-depth, well-rounded story. How does this technology impact this community? How does it impact that community? Who's involved? I think that's another piece, actually, that we haven't talked about enough is the team is so important on these projects. Trust is so important on these projects. This is investors. This is not, you know, sell me the latest pair of shoes. This is, I'm going to invest in this project because I believe in it. And to do that, I really have to believe in the team. So focus on your team, get those stories out there, and focus on what you're really trying to do in the world and what problems you're trying to solve.
Yeah? Okay, so I think we've covered a lot of tools. Do you guys have any you wanted to add?
Always go to Bitcoin Talk, because not only will you be able to promote your project, but the tiniest flaws will be discovered by them because they're OCD, and they'll find it before the Securities Commissioner does. And that's way better, because they will not fine you. And also, that if they find it, and if your blockchain is going to break because your protocol is wrong, it's better Bitcoin Talk finds it before it just breaks, and that happens.
Absolutely. I know Medium is really huge. There's an amazing community around these projects there. Steemit is quite popular because it is blockchain-based as well. Reddit is pretty good. Unfortunately, I don't have very good Reddit karma. I'm too much of a marketer, but make friends with someone who is, if you're not. Those are really great. Twitter's really good, especially if your project happens to be related to some hot topics. For example, like iComply is not doing an ICO, but with all of this privacy stuff going on, what an amazing opportunity to jump on that news cycle. So look for things like that.
Okay, so some of these questions I think we've talked about, like building a strong marketing strategy. Is there any points you want to add to that, or getting around some of the bans that we see, like Facebook and with Google?
I think, again, when it comes to like Facebook, you got to be pretty crafty. I think it's don't explicitly write ICO in the title, for one. I think, again, it needs to be more informative. Again, maybe it could be content around the entrepreneurs and the story behind it. It could be things like, 5 things to watch out for, something, maybe an ICO. Yeah, I mean, how to do your research on various coins, just different angles, and just kind of working them. And sometimes you'll just have to try things and test them, see if they work. You'll notice sometimes, yeah, I mean, the reach will be docked, and it won't go as far because Facebook somehow figured out that what you're writing about, or someone reports it or something. But there's a way to inform people and get that reach and get it out there, providing that value first, creating that funnel. And then, linking or providing near the end that sort of call to action there. I say that for Facebook is the way to go. And then with Google was the other one, right? Yeah, Google, I'd rely upon SEO. And again, getting the SEO juice, making sure that content is shared on social. It's got the, the right tags and the headings and, all the good SEO stuff.
And even engaging influencers and getting, a lot of these things, they bring on these really great advisors onto their teams, which is great. I mean, it can make you newsworthy, and also if they have a large audience, then you don't have to pay for any ads. They can post it up for you on their channels. So definitely, if you can get influencers on your side, that's a way to get around it as well.
I guess the only additional comment I would have would, I want to keep stressing the make it interesting part. It's way, if you work for a place like News BTC, or there's been other Van Becks who do this kind of thing, the genius isn't picking the right ICO in the first place. And to clarify what I mean by that, that doesn't always mean the one that's most likely to succeed. For example, suppose there's an ICO where everyone on the team have Harvard degrees and they have $10 million of capital, but they're building a Bitcoin wallet. Not super revolutionary. They'll probably win, they'll probably succeed at it, but that's not going to get lots of people really excited because it's been done before. I've seen projects that are easier to promote for us just because of the nature of what they're doing. If it's something new and exciting, no one likes copycats. Although the market needs copycats to compete with each other so that the best one wins, it's less fun to market that.
Great, so we're gonna go back to the audience.
2 quick questions. One, do you see a long time frame for the sort of celebrity, even pertinent celebrity advisor? Like Brittany, you were saying, having somebody that's great on your advisory board who really mostly brings cachet, maybe limited expertise. And then the other part about marketing is, can't we just go on random telegrams and type about our great project there?
It's interesting. I've been kind of watching some of these influencers, but some of these advisors, and some of them seem to be just advising everything. And it's kind of, okay, how involved are you really? So maybe they have a lifespan, maybe some of them more so than others. Some of them who are really involved, I think, those are the ones you'd probably want more so, rather than the person that just slaps their name on 50 projects and just dilutes their reputation that way. So look for the ones, I'd say, that seem to be more choosy about what they get involved in. And don't spam Telegram groups, please. There's enough going on in there. Actually, on the note of the Telegram groups, there's a few different strategies I've seen people using, and some of them it's just like free-for-all. I open it up, oh my goodness, there's 5,000 messages. How useful is that really? Like, you know, it is good because it keeps it at the top of my Telegram feed, so I'm seeing that brand every time I open Telegram, every time. Many times a day I see that brand, and that's awesome because I will remember it. I may not read a single message in there. Cool, but you know what? I know that brand. So that's one way. Another thing is some people keep it closed and people can't actually comment on it. This is cool for sending out announcements, but I don't know. I think it's really how you want to approach that way. There's either one is good, but if you are going to have people allowed to post in it, make sure you have more than one person managing it if you can. Have a few people, and look out for scammers. If there's certain things like some people, oh, send me Ether, this and that, you know, have in the things, hey, we will never ask for Ether, stuff like that. A lot of scammers out there. And that's another thing, even when the ICO is running, a lot of people will show up and, oh, hey, you know, set up a fake website and send us Ether, this and that. So definitely keep an eye out for those things.
Okay, here we go. Question?
So not always, often enough, the token represents some network value, some unit of network value. And the goal is to build this giant network and get this network effect. If you start down the path of kind of painting out your usage of funds for not investors, then you'll kind of paint this story of this is how we're going to spend this much on paid, and then we're going to assume we're going to get this much with organic, and this is how the network's going to grow, and blank, 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 leads to token doing what, right? So my question is kind of, who can you tell that story to? Can you tell it to early investors that are accredited? Can you put that kind of roadmap on your website? Just wanted to know your thoughts on it.
So the question is how, so you have, is whether or not to share your roadmap, or?
Are you talking more about utility tokens?
Yeah, so if you show your usage of funds and how you're going to grow this network, it's ultimately related to the value of the token. The token gives you access to some goods, services, whatever on the network. The network has some big bang boom hockey stick kind of effect, and that's what everyone's kind of hoping for. So where do you stop in telling your market strategy, you know, and how you're going to use the ICO funds? Like, where do you kind of stop that story?
So, I mean, the more transparency, the better. But are you afraid more on a, like a competitive basis in terms of sharing too much? Is that what you mean?
For regulation.
For regulation. I mean, I think, you know, the more transparency, the better, right? Investors always want to know the usage of funds, you know, where the money's going, where it's being spent. But I mean, on a regulation basis, I don't know. I'm not super more on the marketing side, right? You know?
I think that would be more so forecast trends. Like, hey, we're going to make this much at X versus this is the product for release. That's what you get into.
Yeah, and I think on the specific on the regulation side, if you're looking at it from the perspective of even using terms like use of funds, you're really starting to move into the securities world already. If your network, if you're raising money for the network, then the concept is that the network's there and it's just adding users, and by buying in, you're becoming a part of this network. So therefore, the network effect is happening. But if you're raising money in order to market, to grow the network, to get a return on the money that the guy put in, it's already getting into that really speculative scenario that me, it starts to make the spidey senses tingle a little bit, where I'd be calling a securities lawyer to say, hey, are we okay to do this? So
It's a little pyramid schemey, maybe.
possibly.
All right, so we can take one more question from the audience. All right.
Actually, this one's specifically for Andrew, as I watched your investing in ICOs at Van Funden. So, you guys have talked about Facebook and Google and all of that stuff, but specifically, the community is pretty smart. So from what you've seen when you've invested or when people actually invest, what are they looking for? Like, right, Steemit and Bitcoin Talk, but also new stuff like when you're talking about actually due diligence, you know, they're not going to fall for all the ads. So what do they, or what they're actually talking due diligence on the actual SEO?
That's a good point. You can often fool people, and often in trying to fool people, you will lose people. Like, there's a certain class of investor that you will win over through terrible tactics and FOMO. And there's another class of investors who will see you doing that to the first class of investors, and thereafter have nothing to do with you ever. And in the long term, the second class is usually more valuable than the first class, because the first class is going to lose all their money eventually, because they keep throwing it around that way. I would say, yeah, you know, if you're reaching out to people, be intellectually honest. This is what I'm doing. This is how. Answer questions. And, you know, a lot of these people are wily. You know, there's an idea held by a lot of regulators that you need to be an accredited investor, because if you weren't, how could you be educated enough to make these decisions? The crypto industry is a place where there are people who are not accredited investors who can understand these things. So, you know, a lot of, like, for example, you know, they know that we can't promise them great returns, that will get shut down, and you can't guarantee a thing like that anyway. You can say things like, this is our supply of tokens is this much. Then you can't say, therefore, the price will do this. You know, there's going to be some in-between-the-line reading on their behalf. Just say what you're doing, and don't say, like, you know, therefore I'm great. You know what I mean? I don't know.
All right, so we're going to move on to a couple more questions here. Just an important note before we go any further, just as the audience is aware, we are not legal experts on what, in terms of the panelists here, they're not lawyers. So what we encourage you to do is hear their perspective and do your research and get a sound legal opinion from a good lawyer before you make any decisions when it comes to what type of offering you're going to do and what kind of marketing you're going to do for that. All right, so next question. Can you provide an example of an ICO that has done a great job marketing itself?
Well, I talked earlier about how Filecoin did that amazing video with Bloomberg. I thought that was fantastic, bringing people inside the process and really brought them inside their mission. It was about beyond what they were doing. It was about a really, really exciting sound mission. So I thought that was really great. Like I said, I thought the clear messaging that Civic did was really great. Know your audience, for sure. I think RightMesh locally has done an amazing job really being clear about their vision and what they're trying to do, and really coming at it with just this very earnest approach that shines through everything that they do. I'd say those are definitely some good examples.
Okay. All right. What are some of the specific traits that the most successful ICOs all have in common?
I guess I want to caveat, like, I was hesitant about the last question for the same reason of this question, and that, like, the answer of, like, being, you know, there's ways to be good at marketing an ICO that I don't want you to do that, like FOMO, and, you know, you can, if by good marketing you mean raise $200 million and don't care what happens afterwards, then I recommend Google ads, Facebook ads, lots of FOMO and bonuses early on, and then disappearing to some offshore place once it's done. But if by, you know, that's what I mean. And there's some gray area there, right? I've seen ICOs that probably raised less money than they could have if they'd employed a little FOMO, but then their investors got more returns in the end, and that makes them have a stronger community in the long run because no one's hunting for their heads because of all the money they lost.
That's a good answer. All right. If your marketer, the people you hire, if they break the rules for marketing an ICO, who is in trouble?
Hopefully not me.
Yeah, I second that.
Third that, yeah. I think everyone's in trouble, though.
It's a good question, actually. I guess it would really depend on the situation. I wish I was a legal expert right now.
Yeah. All right. And what should I look for? So if you're looking for a marketing agency, what should you look for to find a good one?
I think one that can, build the brand, build a story, create beautiful assets, and then hopefully has a distribution to get that out there as well.
And also understanding what you're trying to achieve. Like, it's one thing to, okay, we're going to spend all this money and we're going to get you everywhere and this and that, but really understanding what are your values, what are you trying to achieve, what mission are you really on, and if they can understand the technology side too, I think that's a big bonus, because you don't want people talking about you who don't know what they're talking about. So make sure they get it. That's pretty important. But yeah, somebody who can really jive with you and tell a great story, and someone who you enjoy working with, because it's going to be a long trek.
Okay, a few more audience questions here.
Thanks. We're in the process of launching a... So we've been trying to launch a organic coconut plantation offshore, and we were told to do an IPO. So we were working on the IPO, and while we were right in the middle of it, one of the issues is about whether it's organic and following it right through the blockchain to the ultimate consumer. So someone said, you should go with an ICO. So now we're trying to debate the benefits of an ICO as opposed to, or do both. IPO, because of regulatory and, from a regulatory perspective, we're not doing the IPO in Canada, it's offshore. The ICO, we're thinking of doing it in Canada, so just don't know where to go.
Well, ICO, so you can say initial coconut offering.
Thank you. That's like in PR. Thank you.
No, that's not. Do we have a better answer?
I think if you intend to use blockchain technology, that adds more weight to the idea of using an ICO, because you may be, in experimenting with blockchain tech, you may find it's possible you may need a token anyway, and at that stage you need a way of launching that token, and at that point it's your choice if you want to mix that with a fundraising mechanism that may be more efficient. But if you didn't plan, that's what like some people have no plans to use blockchain technology at all and still want to ICO. That can still be smart depending on what you're doing, but like think about it like if you want to do the organic thing where you're tracing and the consumer can be sure, which is a hot thing right now actually. A lot of people are interested in that right now. In that sense, that makes sense to tokenize kind of, and the ICO argument makes more sense because of that point.
I definitely agree. I see that trend growing to the whole usage of blockchain in the supply chain. Really, really hot, really exciting. And I think it would be really cool and a lot of fun to work on a project like that. It would make you stand out. There's so many there's a coconut craze right now. It's apparently good for everything. So this would make it stand out. I think that could be really cool.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with them. Absolutely, people are headed towards that direction. It's hot right now, and it's a true, real use case right now as well with the blockchain technology.
All right, we have a question in the back.
Thanks a lot, guys. So my question is, the reality is that ICOs are just an end run around traditional funding mechanisms, and a lot of the companies that are funded through ICOs wouldn't make it the light of day through traditional funding mechanisms. So in situations like this gentleman's situation, if you actually can survive proper funding through traditional means, you actually have a considerably higher probability of more longevity with your company, because you have to be more resilient, you have to have more substance. And so what particularly do you guys see for yourselves? Like, would you actually pursue an IPO at some point, or would you stay on the ICO side? Granted, ICO is a lot easier for the funding side, but for the longevity of the company, how would you split those hairs?
I I think it depends on the project, and if blockchain is an integral part of that project, it may make sense to go that ICO route. If you're just trying to raise money, maybe it would be better to go through traditional means. You know, you actually also see lately public companies even doing ICOs, and you know, you see people doing both, and I think it really depends on the structure of the company.
Yeah, again, like Brittany was saying, it depends on the project. I mean, I've seen a company that is going IPO and getting those investors in, and is actually waiting for some blockchain technology to catch up to be able to do, like, let's say, for example, high volume of transactions, and so then they're going to do the ICO after. So again, it depends project to project, I think. You make a good point though with you know, going public and the longevity aspect of it, but you can do both.
I disagree with the premise of the question that ICOs are mostly meant for circumventing regulation. It's not in that all of us want to not be regulated. It's that we want to avoid paperwork and bureaucracy, which is a different thing philosophically and ethically. You know, if it were easy to do an IPO, if it were as easy as talking to Bitrex, like, yo, I made a coin, can you list it? That'd be great. It's not. There's a lot, and I don't even know, I don't have a bank myself. I'm that type of person, so I actually don't even understand that system. The blockchain makes more sense, and it's efficient, and I can do all this overnight just by coding some stuff. Can I launch an IPO in such a simple fashion? It requires more money and resources to do such a thing. Or at least from my generational perspective, you know, we're familiar with it digitized in that fashion, if that makes sense, you know. Even for things like taxation, you know, crypto people aren't always mad that we have to pay taxes. We're mad at how long it takes. Like, if you had a button, comply with regulations, that's fine, I would press that button. But ICOs make the button easier to press. That's the real thing for us. It saves me time. And I get bored. I don't like my time wasted.
Totally, and I actually think that the way we do ICOs today, I think it's going to change a lot, especially as regulation catches up. And I actually think the same way that gaming and porn in the military advanced other technologies, I think ICOs are that same catalyst for the financial industry and the capital markets. The technology is going to supersede any ICO craze that we see now, and it's going to build the future of what capital markets are.
I think it's just built more of that investing ecosystem almost in a way. I think with ICOs, as well, and various other companies. So it's been good overall.
I'd just add one thing to that as well with the perspective of IPO versus ICO. I think there was a comment from the panel about it, you know, being you can do both. There's a number of companies that we've talked to that are publicly traded companies looking to do ICOs. And when you're doing an ICO, is it a utility, i.e. not a security, or are you issuing it as a security? Is it some sort of property or access to your network or an air miles token, credits, you know, like all sorts of different ways this technology can be used. So how it's being used could have a big piece of that as well. But then you also get into the scenario where you'll see, you know, we were in Singapore recently and we saw, you know, some of the companies that you're talking about, this concept of graduation. So why go through the whole VC headache when you can do a private round, a pre-sale, ICO, and then migrate up to going public with an IPO. And I think we'll also see publicly listed companies say, hey, wait a minute, I'd rather have direct access to my shareholders, engage them as a larger community. Like if you imagine if Apple decided to delist from the stock exchange today and do an ICO and give every single shareholder a token, you'd be talking about the most engaged community you'd ever seen, because they're directly engaged with their investors. So I think there's a lot of room of where it's going to go, and there's going to be a lot of very interesting things in the next couple of years.
I love that point. I was doing some work for a public company that was talking about doing an ICO, and that was actually one of the benefits they were talking about. It's like, hey, for the first time, we're really going to be able to have that kind of engagement with our investor base.
And I'm just going to add one thing to that, is our entire company was built on the premise that it's not an either-or situation. And our very first client who actually signed up with us with the expectation of doing an ICO and going through the process was a real estate developer who had done successful deals. And for him, he is generally in business someone who's very conservative, not a risk taker. This is not a high speculation tech company. And the reason he wanted to do an ICO is he wanted to follow the rules, and he just saw the efficiency of the blockchain, and that's what appealed to him. So I think what we're going to see and where the trend is headed into more legitimate offerings. And I think we're going to see a lot more companies that we recognize and that we respect entering the space. And as that happens, that's really going to shift the overall perception of this market. And that comes along with the regulation piece. Right, another question.
This question is for Andrew. This goes back to the influencer marketing. What are your thoughts on paid influencers that manipulate your ICO, like John McAfee, for example?
Is he paid to do that? I think he's just kind of weird.
He pumped and dumped Verge.
Like, I think he just does that. I mean, I don't know. But I think that might be the case, that he just does that because he's odd. He tweets a coin a day. But, you know, in general, yeah, pick your influencers. I think he's not really an advisor on all those things he's tweeting.
He is an advisor to a few tokens. I'm working on one. It's called knowledge.io.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if he's...
Well, he was doing one tweet a day, or like a coin a day at one point, and I don't think he was advisor to every coin he tweeted every day, because that would be a lot of advising. You know, at the nature of it, all advisors are going to be compensated in some fashion. I play advisor to a token or two, and I get some tokens in response. You really just gotta vet your advisor, I guess, like what kind of person he is, why'd he pick this project, is he a scam artist, blah, blah, blah. Avoid the used car salesman types.
Questions?
So this is with the current market situation not being the best with the crypto sphere at the moment. You see a lot of ICOs that are currently launching not nearly hitting their hard cap goals. A lot of them also drop to pre-ICO or even lower price points when they launch on exchanges. What do you believe is the best marketing strategy at the moment to? I know this is very broad, but or marketing avenues, for instance, to prevent that kind of thing from happening, because that often deters further investment. And how do you think that's going to change once the crypto sphere supposedly picks up, which a lot of people think will happen?
I think that going in really, as we said before, kind of showing the real value and what is this actual product, and not focusing as much on the crypto community, but really trying to tell that story to the broader community, which can often mean like dumbing it down a little bit and breaking it down a little bit. I think that's a good way to go about that. But at the same time, I mean, things go up and down. You could also play it like, hey, it's cheap right now, get in, right? So it's just kind of the nature of the beast. We went through this kind of crazy hype for a while, and maybe things are just leveling out now, and this is just where it should be. And it's actually interesting. I had a good conversation with Thomas Linder from MME in Switzerland, and he was saying, because he was there at the beginning, and like all that stuff. And he was saying, you know, at the beginning, it was all about the technology, and it wasn't, and people were just okay with losing money, and they just wanted to invest. And then suddenly people saw this money, and everybody came in, and it was all about the money, and nobody cares about the technology anymore. And so I think we've gone through this interesting cycle where, oh my gosh, tech, wow, money, and like, okay, let's go back to this nice normal place again. So I think that's probably what we're going to see.
I think just like with any market, you know, if it's even the stock market, you're going to have different market forces, right? You're going to have, you know, supply and demand. You're going to have, you know, external shocks. Like, for example, in the public markets, you have all this talk about tariffs and this and that. So like Brittany's saying, there's going to be ups and downs. You know, if you really believe in the underlying technology and what it brings, I would just hang tight and just hold, hodl.
I was thinking somebody was going to say that.
Yeah, what they said. I don't think your marketing strategy should be very correlated to whether the market is currently bearish or bullish. If it were, that would imply a lack of long-term believability, I think. Like, and also, people tend to peg their crowd sale rate to Satoshis. So whether or not, for example, ESL Coin, we're doing that. So as the price of Bitcoin fluctuates, the cost of buying ESL Coin with your Bitcoin remains static. True, the cost of getting in from fiat alters as the market gets volatile, but since most of these ICOs will peg to Bitcoin or Ethereum, you have no incentive to consider I should dump into or out of Ethereum versus an ICO.
Last question.
Just for the panel about airdrop. How do you feel about airdrops, and if you thought it was a good strategy, when would you decide to go ahead with that?
I've definitely seen it generate buzz.
It sounded like a butt-like answer. I mean, yeah, they get very fad-like at some point. I think you should, unless it's very targeted, like, again, the ESL Coin example, we'll do a thing like an airdrop, kind of, but for ESL students. If you just put out money everywhere, I think the efficiency of your returns can be slightly diminished, except that you'll catch a wave of bounty seekers, which will be a short kind of pump and dump sentiment that'll catch you. They'll go on Twitter and pump your coin a bit. Like, long term, I don't worry about that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I wouldn't say that's the direction I would suggest if, like, you're thinking, oh, this will just generate all this excitement and this, because do any of those people actually care about what you're building? That's not the investor base that you necessarily want. Although it can generate excitement, I'll give it that. But long term, maybe not so good.
Yeah, I agree. Just dabble into it, maybe.
All right, well, thank you so much. We've run out of time for extra questions, but if you want to connect with the panelists afterwards, you're more than welcome to. So thank you guys for coming out, and we hope to see you next time.